The Crying Baby. Hello friends, welcome to the Horror Ghost Stories. The story begins. In the dead of night, Sarah lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt suffocating. Just as she started to drift off to sleep, a faint noise cut through the stillness, the sound of a baby crying. She froze. She didn't have any children, and the only baby in the neighborhood was her niece, who lived several miles away. At first, she thought it was just a figment of her imagination. But as the minutes ticked by, the crying grew louder, more desperate, echoing through the empty hallways of her house. Her heart raced as she hesitated. Should she investigate? Her home was large, an old Victorian-style house with creaky floorboards and long hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. There were no babies in the house. She lived alone. The sound of the crying intensified, now accompanied by a faint whimpering, like someone in distress. Trembling, Sarah got out of bed, her bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. She walked slowly toward the source of the noise, her mind racing with all sorts of thoughts. What if it was just a trick of the wind, or maybe something outside? She turned the corner into the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The crying seemed to be coming from the attic. As she stood at the bottom of the stairs that led up to the attic, the air grew colder, and the crying became more frantic, more urgent. A chill ran down her spine. The attic door was always locked, or so she thought. She never used the attic, and no one else had access to it. But tonight, something felt off. With a trembling hand, Sarah reached for the door, her fingers brushing against the cold, smooth wood. She pulled the door open, the creak of the hinges making her jump. As the door swung open, the crying stopped. For a long, horrifying moment, all Sarah could hear was the pounding of her own heart. The attic was pitch black, but she could feel a presence, something unseen and menacing lurking in the shadows. She took a step back, her mind fighting against the primal urge to flee. Then, from the darkness, came a whisper, barely audible but distinct, "Help me." The voice was soft, almost childlike, but there was something wrong with it. It was not the voice of a baby, but of someone trying to mimic one. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knew she had to leave, but her body refused to obey. Suddenly, the crying started again, louder than ever. It filled her ears, vibrating through her skull, clawing at her sanity. She backed away, but her feet wouldn't move fast enough. She felt a cold hand brush against her shoulder, sending her into a panic. She spun around, but there was no one there. The crying didn't stop. It only grew louder, more chaotic, and closer. Sarah ran down the hallway, not caring about the noise of her feet slapping against the floor. She stumbled into the living room, trying to catch her breath. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the air grew thick with an unnatural heaviness. She grabbed her phone, her hands shaking so violently she could hardly dial. As she pressed the call button, the screen flickered, then went black. She tried again, but the same thing happened. The crying continued, now sounding as though it was coming from inside the walls. Panicked, Sarah ran to the front door, yanking on the handle. It wouldn't budge. Her pulse raced as she tugged at the door with all her strength, but it was as if something invisible was holding it shut. Desperation took over, and she ran to the windows, throwing open the curtains and looking outside. But there was no one. The street was empty, bathed in the pale light of the moon. The world seemed eerily still. She turned back to the house, only to hear the whisper again. "Help me." It was louder now, echoing through the walls, making it impossible for her to tell where it was coming from. She turned toward the stairs and froze. There, at the top of the staircase, stood a figure, a small, shadowy shape. It was a child, but there was something deeply wrong about the way it stood there, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by the faintest sound of footsteps on the stairs. Slowly, the figure started descending, its head still tilted at that strange angle, its eyes hollow and black. Each step creaked under its weight, each movement deliberate, as if it were savoring her fear. Sarah backed away, her back hitting the wall. She could feel her breath coming in shallow gasps, her chest tight with terror. She had no way to escape. There was no way out. The figure reached the bottom of the stairs. The room was freezing now, the temperature dropping so quickly she could see her breath in front of her. The shadow moved toward her, its eyes boring into hers with an intensity that paralyzed her. It didn't say anything, but the air was thick with an unspoken promise of dread. Without warning, the figure lunged at her, and Sarah screamed, stumbling back into the wall. Her mind was spinning, her body frozen in terror. The last thing she remembered was the cold, clammy touch on her skin before everything went black. When Sarah awoke, she was lying in the middle of her living room floor. The house was silent again. The air was thick with an unsettling calm, and the lights flickered above her. Her phone was still in her hand, but the screen was shattered. She slowly stood up, every part of her body aching. The house seemed unchanged, but she knew it was different. The air felt heavier, suffocating. She looked around, searching for any sign of the child, the crying, anything. But the house was empty. Except for one thing, a small, handprint-sized smear of blood on the floor, just beyond the spot where she had fallen. And the soft, distant sound of a baby crying. The house had changed, it had become something else, something worse. And the cries would never stop. Sarah's breath quickened as she stared at the smear of blood on the floor. The unsettling quiet was worse than the cries, it felt like the calm before a storm. Her skin tingled, a cold sweat forming on the back of her neck. She needed to get out, but her legs felt like lead. She forced herself to move, one slow step after another, her eyes darting nervously toward the staircase, then the front door. She reached the door, her trembling hand gripping the handle. But once again, it wouldn't budge. It felt like the walls were closing in, as if the house itself were alive, watching her, trapping her. Turning away from the door, she heard it again, the faint cry, the sound of a baby wailing from somewhere deep within the house. It was so real, so vivid, she could almost feel the wetness of the tears in the air. But Sarah knew better now. That wasn't a baby. It couldn't be. There were no babies here, not anymore. The crying seemed to be coming from the kitchen, soft at first, then building in volume, almost as though it was following her. Every step she took made the cry louder, and it was starting to drive her to the brink of madness. Her fingers brushed against the walls as she walked down the hallway, her every instinct screaming at her to leave. But she couldn't. The house was holding her captive, and no matter where she went, the sound of the baby echoed louder and louder, impossibly real. She reached the kitchen door, the crying now unmistakably sharp, almost shrill. As she turned the handle, the door creaked open on its own. Sarah stepped into the dark room. It was empty. The only sound now was the rhythmic thudding of her heart and the cry that seemed to have no origin. The kitchen was in disarray. Chairs were overturned, and dishes were scattered across the floor. It was as if someone had been frantically searching for something, or running from something. She could feel the presence of someone behind her. Slowly, Sarah turned, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing in the doorway of the next room, was the same shadowy figure. It was smaller now, hunched over, its face still obscured in darkness, but she could feel its eyes on her. It wasn't moving, but Sarah could sense its hunger. The baby's cry grew louder, and suddenly it wasn't just one cry. There were many overlapping, frantic, as if 100 babies were wailing from every corner of the house. The sound was deafening, maddening. It made Sarah's head spin, each cry twisting in her mind like a knife. Her knees gave way, and she collapsed to the floor. The shadowy figure took a slow step toward her, and Sarah's body locked in terror. The cries reached a crescendo, and the air in the room became thick with despair. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. It was as if the entire house was alive, pulsating with the cries, the cold, the darkness. Then, from the corner of her eye, Sarah saw something move, a fleeting shadow in the kitchen. It was a child, small and ragged, crawling across the floor, its face obscured. It moved unnaturally fast, its limbs jerking like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. Sarah screamed, stumbling backward, but the shadow moved toward her with inhuman speed, its mouth stretched open, an eerie, hollow sound coming from its throat. The baby's cries stopped for a moment, replaced by an eerie, guttural whisper, "Help me." The words were wrong. The voice was wrong. It was not a child's voice, but the voice of something older, something sinister. And it wasn't asking for help. It was demanding it. In the dim light, the figure slowly began to come into focus. It was a child, or what used to be a child, its skin stretched tight over its bones, its eyes empty and black. Its lips cracked in a grotesque grin, and the blood-red tears that streamed down its face seemed to shimmer as if they were made of something far worse than water. Sarah could barely breathe, barely think. All she knew was that she needed to escape. She reached for the kitchen knife on the counter, her fingers numb as she wrapped them around the cold steel. The child's grin widened, and with a sickeningly fast lunge, it was at her side. It grabbed her wrist, its fingers cold as ice. The shadow that had been watching her now moved, stepping into the kitchen and looming over her. The presence of it was suffocating, and Sarah could hear the heavy breathing, slow and deliberate. "Run," the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't from the child. It was from somewhere else, somewhere deep within the walls, or maybe even from the house itself. It wasn't asking. It was telling. With every ounce of strength, Sarah shoved the creature off of her, knocking it back a few steps. She didn't think, didn't hesitate. She ran, stumbling through the hallway toward the back door. It was the only chance she had left. The house was alive with noise now, the cries, the whispers, the scraping of unseen claws on the walls. She reached the door, her heart pounding. Her fingers fumbled with the lock. She could feel something behind her, watching her, moving closer. She turned the handle with trembling hands, her pulse thundering in her ears. With a final, desperate push, the door swung open, and Sarah burst into the night, gasping for air. But as soon as she stepped outside, the door slammed shut behind her, and the cries stopped. The night was still. The house was silent. But Sarah knew that it wasn't over. The house had let her go for now, but it was waiting. Waiting for her to return. And one day, she would. She would have no choice. The cries would always lead her back. Sarah stood outside, the cool night air biting at her skin, but the chill that gripped her heart was far colder. Her legs shook beneath her, and she couldn't stop her body from trembling. She glanced back at the house, its windows dark, its silhouette against the moonlight like a predator lying in wait. The cries had stopped, but the silence that followed felt like an ominous promise. She wasn't safe. She knew that much. The house had let her leave, but it hadn't let her go. Her heart pounded as she took a step back, then another. She wanted to run, to get as far away as possible, but her feet felt heavy, as if the ground itself was trying to hold her in place. The memory of the shadowy figure, the wailing cries, the feeling of being trapped, filled her mind, and she couldn't shake the image of the child's hollow eyes, staring into her soul. But what if she was wrong? What if it was all just a nightmare, a figment of her imagination brought to life by the loneliness of the old house? She had to know. She had to go back and face whatever was waiting for her. With her mind racing, Sarah forced herself to walk toward the driveway. The street lights flickered as she passed beneath them, casting eerie shadows on the pavement. Her phone was still in her pocket, its shattered screen a stark reminder of the nightmarish events that had unfolded. She pulled it out, her fingers numb as she tried to dial for help. But once again, the screen remained black, unresponsive. Her breath caught in her throat as she heard something, a soft rustling in the bushes. She turned quickly, but there was nothing there. The street was still empty, and the air was unnaturally quiet. The sound of her heartbeat in her ears was deafening. Sarah forced herself to walk faster, reaching the end of the driveway and glancing over her shoulder one more time. The house loomed behind her, silent as a tomb. She had to get away. She had to keep moving. And yet, her feet turned toward the front door again. She didn't want to go back. She couldn't go back. But her body betrayed her, her legs moving of their own accord, pulling her closer to the door as though some invisible force was drawing her in. When she reached the door, she reached for the handle once more. It gave way easily, swinging open with a soft creak that seemed too loud in the stillness of the night. Inside, the air was thick with an unnatural cold. The house was darker than she remembered, the shadows stretching unnervingly long, as if they were alive and twisting toward her. And then, from somewhere within the house, she heard it again, the crying. Soft, distant at first, like a baby lost in the night. But this time, the cries weren't frantic. They were slow, almost melodic, as if they were calling her, beckoning her into the depths of the house. The air grew heavier as she stepped into the hallway. It felt like walking through a dense fog, each breath harder to take than the last. She had no choice but to move forward, the sound of the cries guiding her, pulling her deeper into the darkness. Her footsteps echoed in the hall, each one amplified by the silence around her. It was then that she noticed the walls, the strange marks that marred the surface, dark streaks like old blood, like something had been dragged along the walls. And the deeper she went, the worse the marks became, until the walls themselves seemed to pulse, alive with some dark energy. The cries grew louder, closer. The air became so cold that she could see her breath in front of her, but the cold wasn't natural. It was as though the house was feeding on her fear, growing stronger with every step she took. Her heart was hammering in her chest, her legs shaking uncontrollably. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. And then she saw it. The staircase. The one that led to the attic. She hadn't dared go up there before, and she had no intention of doing so now. But the cries were coming from there, and they weren't going to stop until she reached the top. With one last, shaky breath, Sarah started toward the stairs. As she climbed, each step seemed to groan under her weight, the house alive with the sound of the wood straining beneath her. The cries were now a full, agonizing wail, and Sarah felt like her mind was about to shatter under the pressure of the noise. When she reached the attic door, it was ajar. A thin sliver of light flickered from within, casting eerie shadows on the floor. She had to go in. She had to know what was causing this torment. Her hand, shaking violently, reached for the door and pushed it open. The attic was a twisted nightmare. The space was vast, larger than it had any right to be, stretching farther than the house's structure should allow. The air was thick with dust, and in the corners, shadows seemed to move of their own accord. The light flickered again, revealing a small figure crouching in the farthest corner. The crying stopped. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the figure slowly turned around. It was the child, the same child. But it wasn't a child at all. Its skin was pale and translucent, its limbs twisted and broken in ways that made her stomach churn. The eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to stretch on forever. It tilted its head, its neck cracking unnaturally, and a voice rasped from its mouth, dry and full of malice. "You shouldn't have come back." Sarah wanted to run, to escape, but her body refused to move. She was frozen, trapped by the dark presence in front of her. The figure crawled toward her, its movements jerky, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. With each step, the air grew colder, the shadows closing in around her. The wailing started again, but this time, it wasn't just one baby, it was a chorus, a multitude of voices, all crying in unison. And then, she heard it. The whisper. "Join us." The figure lunged at her, its hands outstretched, its mouth opening wide, and all Sarah could do was scream as everything went black. The end.